dialogue is very important because I think it will help specifically on Action Track 2 that we are leading civil society. It will help to establish some criteria, some demands from the various stakeholders that are engaging in the Food System Summit. So this dialogue essentially is going to be asking the question, what do we as civil society and other stakeholders want to see coming as a minimum coming out of the Food System Summit across 5 different stakeholder groups. One is multilateral spaces, so like UNFSS, FAO, and so forth. The other one is national governments. The third one is subnational governments, so like cities, states, territories. And then there is businesses and investors. And finally, there is like civil society and farmers. So the day after the summit, what is the recommendations from those who are engaging in that dialogue? What do they want to see coming out of the summit? That's the first question. And based on that, we want to then make recommendations saying, well, if we want to see X on the day after the summit, you need to do Y today to make that happen. And a specific case, a specific example I can give now relates to what I talked about before about countries, because there are not enough countries in there now. So if like one demand coming out of the dialogue could be, well, we need many more countries to actually be part of the Food System Summit. We cannot just have like 50 to 60 countries. We need at least 100 countries that are fully immersed and bought into the Food System Summit. Okay, if we want to do that, what needs to happen? The Food System Summit is the first of its kind. So this year in 2021 will be the first year where there's a multilateral stakeholder engagement, which essentially just means a lot of countries and all stakeholders within those countries like business, civil society, farmers, decision makers getting together and addressing the issue of how can we ensure that we shift to food systems that are working with the planet as opposed to against the planet, that is creating safe, nutritious food in an abundance that is available and affordable to people, so equitable food distribution and availability and affordability, and doing so in a way that is fair to everybody, including the farmers. So this is the first time that something of this magnitude actually is being held. It is not intended to replace any of the other larger international fora we see now, such as the FAO or the UNFSS or the Convention on Biodiversity, for instance. It's supposed to become kind of like an umbrella function that kind of takes all these different very important fora and brings it together to focus on biodiversity, health, social development, equity, and so forth, and all of which together would be driving the SDGs towards a much better world in 2030. So this is the first time it's being held this year, and hopefully it will be a recurrent affair. But there's a lot at stake this year, and people are quite nervous and people are quite excited at the same time, because this is a great and unprecedented opportunity, and it's the responsibility of all stakeholders, including civil society, and thereby including 50 by 40, to maximize this opportunity to help to push things in the right direction. Officially, I'm the Global Society lead for Action Track 2, which is on sustainable consumption. There are 5 action tracks, and the Action Track 2 is the one that is very much focusing on the health aspects, which is why the World Health Organization is the anchor institution for that specific action track. It is also focusing a lot on the intersectionality between the production and the consumption of food. So like, how does this relate to the farmers? How does it relate to the health of the soil? How does it relate to the consumers and what it does to their bodies? My role there is to make sure that there is proper inclusivity and find a way to ensure that global civil society, which sounds big, and it is, global civil society is enabled to provide not just input, but actually have a seat at the top table to ensure that things are pushed in the right direction. That's one thing. The other thing is that I'm also the liaison with Action Track 5, which is focusing on producing food under increased shock and stress. So those two things combined give us the opportunity, and gives me the opportunity to address very much the aspects of how can we produce food for a growing population in an increasingly climate change constrained world. We will be seeing more droughts, more floods, more erratic weather patterns. How do we ensure resilience so we can produce food? It's good for the planet, good for the people, in a way that makes sure that the distribution of food also is sustainable and equitable. I'm super optimistic, and I'll tell you why. First and foremost, because there's been a kind of a change in terms of how willing people are, consumers and voters, to address the food issue. And the reason for that has been that shifting from a fossil fuel-based economy to a renewable energy-based economy is, for the end consumer, relatively easy if you disregard the pricing issues. Because when you turn on the switch for your lights, whether it comes from solar panels or a coal plant, it doesn't make any change to you. Whereas if you want to vote with your mouth, like how you eat, it changes how you eat 3 times a day. And for many, many years, that has been so difficult to get people around to that. But in the last 2 to 3 years particularly, there's been a big change. And I do believe it's also a generational change. And I've made this point before, that I think that younger people, millennials and downwards, are much more inclined to engage in things that are good, not just for the immediate future, like in terms of like what's good for their bodies, but also very much how it relates to the future, like the climate, in terms of climate change and other issues that are caused by food production. So that is one thing. There's a momentum now where the ones who can push the decision makers, i.e. the voters and the consumers, to make certain choices are much more inclined to do that on the food and climate nexus than has ever been the case before. And then because there are some governments that are seeing these changes and I see that they see the way the wind is blowing. One example is Denmark, for instance, which happens to be the country I'm from originally. And they put in place last year a climate change legislation, not just a policy, but a legislation that dictates that they have to decrease their CO2 emissions by 70% by 2030. And Denmark is doing pretty okay when it comes to renewable energy, which means that there's no chance that they can ever meet that goal without addressing their massive pig production. So they're now faced with these channels that they have to face down the emissions from the pig production, and they have to do that by addressing the quantity they produce. So that is just one example. There are several countries that are starting to own up to that side of the equation. So I think that so many countries are already having those conversations domestically and also regionally, particularly in Scandinavia, and the fact that the consumers are pressing in a new way. I think those two things together and the combination of the Food Systems Summit and a very important COP makes this a very interesting year. I mean, I would just say to anybody who watches this and maybe feel inspired to engage, everybody has a role to play. Everybody. Nobody is completely powerless. I mean, that's a very privileged thing to say, but at least in some parts of the world, most people have some kind of power to make some choices. And you can do that in so many ways. And it's so basic that you can, ask your decision makers to do something about like specific on the policy level. You can ask your school to host seminars. You can ask your employer to bring up debates about food production and so forth. Essentially, you can change so many things either with the way you eat, like your buying habits, if you have the privilege of actually being able to do that, to be very clear, or you can initiate conversations, and you can do that at all levels. Even if you work in a small municipality somewhere and have an assistant job, well, you can raise the issue of like, how do we as a municipality deal with food? How do we deal with food for our schools, for our prisons, for retirement homes, for libraries, whatever there is within the public domain? And who makes those decisions and what can we do about it? Because every little change in society, the smallest little change, always have a ripple effect. So my encouragement is to, no matter who you are, you could always be part of creating change for something better. And I hope 50 by 40 can be a source of inspiration, and we're always here to help.